The wind whipped through the valley, a dry, acrid gust that would strip skin from bone in minutes. But the human stood in the middle of it, breathing deeply as if it were a morning breeze on earth. His hair, silvered from age and exposure, danced wildly around his head, while his skin bore the dark tan of relentless solar radiation. As I watched from the observation platform of the shuttle, I had to remind myself that this planet, designated Kepler 62f, was a death world. By all accounts, no life should survive here, let alone thrive. The atmosphere was filled with microparticles that could shred through the most advanced alloys. The gravity was 1.7 times that of Earth's, and the temperature fluctuations could turn boiling seas into ice in a single sunset. Yet, here stood a human, unshielded, unarmored, smiling at the harsh environment around him. I shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the edges of my environmental suit. My people, the Xyverians, had evolved in calm, stable ecosystems. Even here, within my protective gear, I could feel the crushing weight of this planet's gravity pressing on me, the constant abrasive pull of the atmosphere. I studied the human through the thin slit of my helmet's visor, trying to fathom how he could be so at ease. Beside me, my assistant, a younger Xyverian named Ulnar, tilted his head in confusion. Envoy Sereth, the atmospheric readings are beyond safe limits. Yet he continues, is this normal behavior for their kind? I had no answer, at least not one that made sense. Continue observations. Document every detail. The human finally seemed to notice us, raising a hand in greeting, his grin broad and unbothered by the razor winds that roared around him. A shudder rippled through my body, but I forced myself to wave back. The human turned, motioning for us to follow him across the rocky landscape, toward a hidden valley where they had established their settlement. I glanced back at Ulnar, then to the jagged horizon of this world that had refused life for millennia until now. And with a quiet click of my helmet's visor, I stepped out into the open. The outpost revealed itself slowly as we walked down a jagged path cut into the valley's edge. A few metallic structures clung to the sides like barnacles, cobbled together from repurposed starship hulls and native materials. Solar arrays stretched like desperate hands toward the dull sun overhead, but it was the cratered landscape below that drew my attention. Rows of crops, green and thriving, blanketed the valley floor, another impossibility. I could hardly believe that these fragile plants could survive this harsh environment. The human led us to the center of the settlement, where a few other colonists were gathered around a makeshift table, sharing a meal. They turned as we approached, offering us nods and welcoming gestures. I could sense their ease, their lack of fear in a place that should have been their tomb. It's good to have company out here, the human finally spoke, his voice rough but welcoming. Not many visitors in this part of the galaxy. I am Envoy Sereth of the Xyverians, I replied, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. I am here on behalf of the Galactic Council to assess the progress of your colony. He chuckled, the sound like a dry breeze over gravel. Progress, huh? That's one word for it. Name's Marcus, by the way. Marcus Kane. Been here since the first drop. Figured you folks would have given up on checking in by now. I studied him closely, noting the scars crisscrossing his arms and the gleam of augmented implants beneath his skin. A survivor through and through. Yet there was a shadow behind his eyes, a haunted look that spoke of a past he did not share lightly. We did not expect to find you. Well, we did not expect to find you thriving, I said, choosing my words carefully. Kepler 62f is not suited for habitation by any known species. Marcus shrugged, his gaze sweeping across the valley. Guess you could say we're just too stubborn to die. Hell of a place, though. It tried to kill us more times than I can count. But we learned, adapted. That's what humans do. Adaptation. That word had come up time and time again in the Council's reports on humanity, and it wasn't always spoken with admiration. Survival here is remarkable, but some might say, reckless. He leaned forward, his smile slipping. I've seen reckless, Envoy. What we do here, it's different. We push, and this world pushes back. Harder than anything I've ever faced. But we find a way, every time. My mind buzzed with questions, but I focused on the mission. Our data suggests that your colony has managed to harness the geothermal energy of this world. But those readings are highly irregular, some even say impossible. Marcus raised an eyebrow, then gave a low chuckle. Impossible? Maybe. But we didn't have the luxury of waiting around for the possible solutions to work. He glanced over at the fields, where one of the colonists, barely more than a boy, tended to a glowing apparatus buried in the soil. As I watched, the device pulsed with a strange energy, bending the light around it. The crops near it grew taller and greener than those further away, a clear violation of natural growth patterns. It was as if the very laws of physics bent under their hands. I made a note in my records, but a sense of unease crept through me. What I witnessed here was not merely survival. It was something else, something that defied reason. How did you acquire such technology? Marcus met my gaze directly. We didn't acquire it. We built it. The simplicity of his statement left me momentarily speechless. Built it. That meant humans had not only survived the harsh conditions of Kepler-62f, but had begun to manipulate its very nature. My heart beat faster at the implications. No species I had encountered in all my years as an envoy had shown such a capacity for adaptation. Not so quickly, not in such extremes. Marcus seemed to sense my thoughts. Look, you're not the first to be surprised by what we do out here. But there's something you need to understand. Envoy, we didn't come here to just survive. We came to build, to change what this world is, to make it ours. And what price did you pay for that change? I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop myself. Marcus's smile faded entirely, and the shadow behind his eyes deepened. More than you can imagine, but it's worth it. You'll see. The wind howled through the valley again, carrying with it the scent of iron and earth. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was witnessing something I could not fully comprehend. Behind Marcus's words, behind the quiet determination of the colonists, lay a secret, a truth that even they might not fully grasp. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the alien landscape, I realized that my mission was no longer just to observe. I had to understand what made these humans so different, so capable of defying the natural order. Because if the reports from the outer colonies were true, this was not an isolated case. It was happening everywhere humans had set foot. And if they could bend a world like Kepler-62f to their will, what else could they change? Night fell quickly on Kepler-62f, a shroud that turned the valley into a black maw. In the distance, beyond the edges of the settlement, the sharp peaks of mountains cast jagged shadows against a sky thick with unfamiliar stars. The darkness on this world wasn't gentle. It was absolute, pressing in from all sides, a void that seemed hungry for the light. I adjusted the thermal sensors on my helmet, and the landscape around me bled into shades of crimson and orange. The temperature had plummeted, a drop that would kill most life forms in seconds without protective gear. Yet the humans around me continued their work, bundled in simple jackets, unbothered by the cold. Some stoked fires in makeshift braziers, while others tinkered with devices that thrummed with energy. Marcus led me into a metal structure, the interior lit by a dull yellow glow from suspended lamps. It resembled a command center, with data screens and displays salvaged from a dozen different technologies, some of which I could not even identify. A schematic of the valley glowed on one of the screens, highlighting energy lines and geothermal readings. I could see how the humans had harnessed the heat from the planet's core, redirecting it to sustain their outpost. I marveled at the complexity, the ingenuity. You have achieved this with minimal resources. Marcus tapped one of the displays, and the hologram shifted to show a new energy flow design. We had to. The supply drops from Earth stopped years ago. Ran out of fuel, ran out of tech, so we had to get creative. This planet might try to kill us, but it's got plenty of power if you know how to dig deep enough. Surely, this design took years to develop. He smirked, a trace of pride showing through. Months, actually. When survival's on the line, you learn fast. The alternative isn't really an option, is it? I thought of my own people, how long it took us to adapt even the slightest change to our habitats. For humans, the adaptation seemed to be instinct. It was not merely a survival mechanism, it was a mindset, a way of life. Marcus moved to another console, bringing up footage of a distant sector on the planet's surface, where geysers of steam shot out into the night. We've been expanding beyond the valley, setting up remote outposts. Dangerous work, but we found resources we didn't expect. I leaned in, focusing on the footage. A faint blur moved in the shadows near one of the geysers. Something massive, glistening under the moonlight. What is that? His expression darkened. Local fauna. Not all of them appreciate the new neighbors. Most of them don't bother us if we keep to our valley, but sometimes they wander too close. We've lost a few good people that way. The footage cut out abruptly, the feed turning to static. Marcus shut it off with a grimace. They're getting bolder, but we've learned to deal with threats, even ones we don't fully understand. Before I could ask further, a deep rumble shook the structure, a tremor that rattled the walls and sent loose equipment clattering to the floor. I braced myself against the console, my heart's racing as I tried to regain balance. Marcus, however, merely adjusted his footing, as if the quake was little more than a passing annoyance. Another seismic shift, he said, with the air of someone talking about the weather. Happens pretty often around here. Don't worry, the buildings are reinforced to handle it. I wasn't so sure, but I followed him outside, my feet crunching over the gravel as the ground settled beneath us. The sky had grown darker, the stars swallowed by rolling clouds, and a faint glow pulsed from a distant ridge, an unnatural light that flickered like a heartbeat. Marcus caught me staring at it. We've been tracking that anomaly for a while. Something about the planet's magnetic field, interacting with the geothermal vents. Could be dangerous, but it's also a potential energy source. We're still figuring out how to tap into it. Your curiosity might get you killed, human. He laughed, a short, rough bark. It's kept us alive so far. The words lingered in the cold air, and I felt an unspoken challenge in them. I looked back toward the distant glow, wondering what secrets lay buried beneath this world's surface, and what these humans might do with them if given the chance. Later, in the quiet of night, I retreated to the small quarters they had prepared for me, a room more akin to a metal box, but it was warmer than the exterior. Ulnar had stayed behind at the shuttle, still working to compile the data we'd collected. Alone, I reviewed the day's recordings, replaying the footage of the human settlement, their strange technology, and the way they moved through this world like they belonged here. A message from the council blinked on my communicator, and I hesitated before opening it. They would want a preliminary report, something to explain why I had not yet called for their intervention. I could already imagine the faces of the other envoys, stern, disapproving, skeptical that I could learn anything of value from these upstarts. The words of the message scrolled across the small screen. Provide updates on human capabilities. Clarify their potential threat level. I frowned at the phrasing. The council did not see these humans as equals, not even potential allies. They saw them as a question mark, an unknown variable. Perhaps they were right to be concerned, but my instincts told me there was more to the story. More than just their uncanny ability to survive, to bend the rules of nature to their will. A chime sounded outside the door, and I nearly jumped, catching myself. I slid open the hatch to find Ulnar waiting with a data pad. He looked uneasy, his thin limbs twitching as he handed it to me. Envoy, I've been reviewing the records of other colonies. The ones that humans have established on worlds even less hospitable than this. I took the pad, skimming through the records. The data was unsettling. Planets where atmospheric conditions should have reduced them to ashes, where radiation levels would have driven most beings mad, yet the humans survived. Thrived, even. They had developed technology that could stabilize chaotic elements, had found ways to harvest energy from dying stars and gravity wells. They've accomplished in years what takes most species centuries, Ulnar murmured, almost to himself. It's as if they don't know the meaning of the word impossible. I nodded slowly, my thoughts turning back to Marcus and his confident smile, his casual dismissal of danger. It's more than technology, Ulnar. It's a mindset. They see challenges, and they break them down until there's nothing left standing in their way. Ulnar shivered, his gaze darting toward the door as if expecting shadows to move. But if they apply that mindset to the stars, to the rest of the galaxy? I didn't respond, but I felt the same unease creeping through me, the same gnawing fear that had been growing since I first set foot on this world. A question loomed in the back of my mind, dark and insistent. If humans could bend a place like Kepler 62f to their will, what might they do to a galaxy that tried to resist them? I closed the datapad and turned back to my small window, staring out into the endless night beyond. Somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows of the universe, lay the answer, and I feared that when we found it, it might be far more terrifying than anything the Council could imagine. Dawn on Kepler 62f was a slow, crawling affair. Pale light seeped through the thick cloud cover, casting the valley in a murky twilight that never quite brightened. The settlement came alive in stages, as humans emerged from their makeshift shelters, stretching their limbs against the cold. Marcus was already up, directing a group of workers to repair a damaged conduit along the western ridge. I made my way to the edge of the camp, where Ulnar waited with a portable scanner, his movements jittery with nervous energy. The air crackled with the residual effects of last night's seismic shift, and the glow from the distant ridge seemed stronger, more pronounced against the dull sky. "Envoy," Ulnar greeted, his voice a thin thread of sound. He cast a wary glance toward the humans bustling around us. "I have completed an analysis of the geothermal anomalies. The energy readings are far beyond what should be possible on a world of this size. It's as if the planet's core has been destabilized," I finished for him, feeling a cold certainty settle in my chest. "Intentionally?" Ulnar hesitated, then nodded. "If these readings are accurate, yes, but the technology required to manipulate a planet's core, it is beyond anything we've encountered, even among the advanced species of the Council." I glanced back at the settlement, where Marcus and his crew continued their work, seemingly oblivious to our conversation. Yet, as I observed them, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of far more than they let on. "Are you suggesting that humans might be responsible?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Ulnar's mandibles clicked in distress. "I am saying that if anyone could harness such power with minimal resources, it would be them. They have a way of bending nature to their will, even when it should be impossible." Before I could respond, Marcus approached us, wiping the sweat from his brow despite the frigid air. "You two look like you've seen a ghost. Everything all right?" I forced a neutral expression. "We're just assessing the seismic activity. It seems unusually high for a planet of this stability." Marcus shrugged, but I caught a flash of something in his eyes, curiosity, calculation. "Yeah, well, Kepler's got a way of surprising you, but we're working on stabilizing things, got a few tricks up our sleeve." "Stabilizing?" Ulnar's voice wavered with barely concealed alarm. "Are you suggesting that you have found a way to influence the planet's core?" Marcus tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "Not directly, but we've got ways to channel the energy safely. Just trying to keep things from getting out of hand, you know?" The nonchalance in his tone made my skin crawl. It was as if he spoke of harnessing the heart of a star, with no more concern than one might have for fixing a broken generator. The implications of his words echoed in my mind, and I realized that whatever game the humans were playing here, it went far deeper than I had suspected. Before I could probe further, a shout came from the far side of the camp. One of the workers stumbled back, clutching his arm as dark ichor oozed between his fingers. The others rushed to his side, their movements swift but not panicked, as if such incidents were routine. Marcus' expression hardened, and he waved me off. "Sorry, looks like I've got to handle this. You two should head back to your shuttle, keep out of the cold." I watched as he jogged over to the injured worker, who clutched a crude spear that dripped with some alien fluid. Beyond him, near the edge of the settlement, I caught a glimpse of a creature writhing in the snow, its scaled body torn open, its limbs twitching in a final death throe. Its jagged teeth glinted in the weak light. Ulnar tugged at my sleeve, urging me back toward the shuttle. "Envoy, we should not linger. There are too many unknowns, too many dangers." I nodded slowly, but my gaze remained fixed on Marcus as he crouched beside the wounded worker, his expression grim yet determined. A thought struck me like a thunderclap. If humans could hold their own against the hostile wildlife of this planet, if they had learned to manipulate its very essence, what other secrets were they hiding? Back at the shuttle, Ulnar and I pored over the data he had gathered, analyzing the seismic patterns and the energy surges that seemed to coincide with the human expansion efforts. The anomalies were concentrated around the geothermal vents, as if something was drawing power directly from the planet's core. "It's almost as if they are feeding off it," Ulnar murmured, his voice tinged with awe and dread. "Using the planet itself as a battery." But to what end, I wondered aloud, trying to piece together the fragments of this puzzle. What could they possibly gain from harnessing such volatile energy? Ulnar hesitated, then brought up a map of the valley, highlighting several points of interest, places where the humans had established their outposts, where they had erected strange structures that pulsed with energy. "If I am interpreting this correctly, they are not merely stabilizing the planet. They are changing it, reshaping it." "Reshaping it," I echoed, a chill creeping down my spine. "To what purpose?" His mandibles clicked as he struggled to find the right words. "I do not know, but it is as if they are preparing for something, an event, a shift in the planet's fundamental nature." A memory surfaced, unbidden, Marcus' cryptic words about keeping things from getting out of hand. What did he mean by that? What could these humans possibly be preparing for, on a world so far from their home? I turned to the viewport, where the distant ridge still glowed with that unnatural light. Questions swirled in my mind, each more unsettling than the last. But one thought rose above them all, a gnawing fear that had been growing since my arrival. Had the humans found a way to turn this planet into something new, something they could control? And if so, what did that mean for the rest of the galaxy? As the day drew on, I joined Marcus on another survey of the valley, where the humans had begun constructing a new outpost near the geothermal vents. He explained their methods in broad strokes, but there was a guardedness to his tone, as if he was holding back something vital. "So you're reshaping the terrain itself, redirecting geothermal flows?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Quite ambitious for such a small team. He flashed a tight smile. "Ambition is what got us this far, Envoy. If we're going to survive, we need to think bigger than just a few outposts." His gaze drifted toward the glowing ridge, a flicker of something darker passing across his face. "This place, it's not like Earth. It's alive in a way we don't fully understand yet. But if we can tap into that, we might just make it work for us." I studied his expression, searching for any sign of deceit. But all I saw was determination, a kind of raw, unyielding will that sent a shiver through me. It was the same look I'd seen in the eyes of his workers, as they faced the harsh conditions of this world without flinching. A look that said they would do whatever it took to survive, no matter the cost. But as I watched him, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath that determination lay something deeper, something more dangerous. A secret that could change the course of this world, and perhaps the fate of the entire galaxy. The glow from the ridge pulsed rhythmically, like the slow heartbeat of some slumbering titan beneath the planet's surface. Standing at the edge of the humans' latest construction site, I couldn't help but feel that the entire valley was holding its breath. Every gust of wind that howled through the settlement, every rumble of the ground beneath my feet, seemed to carry a latent energy, a tension, as if the planet itself knew that something was coming. Beside me, Marcus surveyed the landscape with a critical eye. His face was unreadable, as though he were weighing the planet's secrets against some unfathomable plan of his own. Around us, his workers continued their labor, fitting strange conduits into the rocky ground, and raising metallic spires that glowed with a dull, internal light. "What exactly are those structures?" I asked, nodding toward the nearest spire. Its surface was covered in etchings, spirals and symbols that seemed to shimmer as they caught the pale light. Marcus glanced at me, then at the spire, his expression giving away nothing. "We call them anchor points. They help regulate the geothermal flow, prevent it from getting too wild. Think of it as a pressure release valve, keeping things stable while we dig deeper." "Deeper," I repeated, feeling a chill seep into my bones despite the heat radiating from the vents. "How deep are you planning to go?" He smiled, a flash of teeth that seemed more like a warning than a gesture of reassurance. "All the way to the core, Envoy. That's where the real power lies." Before I could press him further, a crackling sound erupted from my communicator, Ulnar's panicked voice cutting through the static. "Envoy, you must return to the shuttle immediately. There is a disturbance near the southern quadrant. I believe it may be related to the human activity." I stiffened, the urgency in his tone igniting a sense of dread. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but I shook my head and turned away, forcing myself not to run as I made my way back to the shuttle. Behind me, I heard him call out, his voice carrying an edge of amusement. "Be careful out there, Envoy. Kepler has a way of surprising even the most prepared." Ulnar met me at the shuttle's ramp, his appendages quivering as he gestured frantically toward the southern horizon. I followed his gaze and saw a plume of black smoke rising into the sky, twisting into the air like an omen. Beyond it, the ground rippled, as if something vast and terrible were shifting just beneath the surface. "What happened?" I demanded, gripping his arm to steady him. "It is the energy readings, Envoy," Ulnar panted, pulling out a data pad with shaking hands. "The seismic activity has spiked again, but this time the epicenter is directly beneath one of the human outposts. It is as if they triggered it." The data displayed on the pad was chaotic, a jumble of spikes and surges that painted a picture of turmoil. Energy levels far beyond the planet's natural threshold, concentrated directly beneath the human structures. It was as if the planet itself was being torn apart, reshaped from within. "We must confront them about this," Ulnar insisted, his voice a high-pitched tremor. "They are meddling with forces they cannot control. If this continues, it could destabilize the entire region, perhaps even trigger a cataclysm." I glanced back toward the settlement, where the humans moved with a purpose that now seemed more sinister than ever. The realization settled over me like a shroud. Marcus and his crew weren't just trying to survive on this world. They were changing it, molding it to their own design. But why? And to what end? Back at the outpost, the humans were gathered near one of the geothermal vents, clustered around a machine that hummed with a deep, throbbing sound. The ground beneath their feet glowed faintly, casting long shadows that wavered with each pulse of energy. Marcus looked up as I approached, his expression shifting from curiosity to impatience. "Back so soon, Envoy? I thought you'd be off analyzing your data." "Marcus, what are you doing?" I asked, my voice hard with barely concealed alarm. "You're destabilizing the planet's crust. If this continues, it could trigger a massive seismic event, one that could wipe out everything on this continent." He met my gaze, and for a moment, I saw something unguarded in his eyes, an emotion that flickered between defiance and something deeper, a determination that burned like a furnace. "You don't understand, Envoy. This world, it's not just a place to survive. It's a chance to start over, to build something new." "By tearing it apart," I demanded, "you're risking the lives of every being on this planet, including your own." Marcus shook his head, a grim smile twisting his lips. "You're thinking too small. You see a threat, but we see an opportunity. This planet, it has potential, more than you can imagine. We're just helping it reach that potential." His words sent a chill through me, the kind that settled in the pit of my stomach and refused to leave. There was a conviction in his tone, a belief that bordered on fanaticism. But beneath that conviction, I sensed a desperation, a need to justify whatever they had done, whatever they were planning. I glanced toward the machine at the heart of their operation, its surface thrumming with barely contained energy. A realization struck me like a lightning bolt. You're not just trying to harness the geothermal energy, you're trying to transform it, to turn it into something else. Marcus' silence was all the confirmation I needed. He met my gaze steadily, unflinching, and in that moment, I understood that whatever he and his people were doing, they would not be deterred. They believed they were on the brink of something monumental, something that could change the very fabric of this world. But at what cost? I returned to the shuttle with a sense of dread coiling tighter in my chest. Ulnar met me with wide, panicked eyes, gesturing wildly toward the data pad. Envoy, the energy surge has increased tenfold. If it continues at this rate, it could. I know, I interrupted, my mind racing. But we need to understand their endgame. They're not just experimenting blindly. They have a purpose, and we need to find out what it is before it's too late. Ulnar hesitated, then nodded, his fear tempered by a spark of determination. I will continue monitoring the anomalies, but, Envoy, I fear that we are running out of time. I watched as he hurried back into the shuttle, his silhouette framed against the pale glow of the sky. I knew he was right. Whatever the humans were planning, it was reaching a critical point, and if we couldn't unravel their motives soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet as I turned back to the valley, my thoughts kept drifting to Marcus and the strange certainty in his eyes. For all his defiance, there had been a truth there, a conviction that hinted at something larger than simple survival. What did he see in this world that I couldn't? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go to achieve it? The storm that swept across the valley that night seemed to mirror the chaos swirling in my mind. Lightning streaked the sky, light the jagged peaks in harsh flashes, while the ground trembled beneath the pounding of the rain. Our shuttle rocked in the gale, and I could hear the structure groaning against the wind. Ulnar clung to the console, eyes darting between readouts, as if hoping that the next surge of data might offer some explanation, some way to reverse the catastrophe that seemed inevitable. It's growing worse, Envoy, he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. The geothermal instability. It's spreading beyond the human sights. The entire region is becoming volatile. I stared at the data on his screen, my mind grappling with the scale of the disaster unfolding. Cracks had begun to spread across the landscape, and new vents were opening miles from the original epicenter. The entire crust seemed to be straining under an unseen pressure, like a creature writhing in agony beneath its skin. "Where is Marcus?" I asked, my voice tight. "Still at the main excavation site," Ulnar replied. "He and his people have not ceased their work, despite the conditions. It is as if they are racing against something, some deadline." A thought, unbidden and terrifying, whispered through my mind. What if they are not racing against the storm, but toward it? I pushed the idea aside, forcing myself to focus. "We need to get to their central outpost, Ulnar. If they won't stop this madness, we need to find a way to disable their equipment ourselves." Ulnar hesitated, his fear writ large across his face. But he nodded, his resolve hardening. "Very well, Envoy. But if we do not return before the next tremor, the shuttle may be swallowed by the ground itself." The journey to the outpost was a grueling slog through the mud and the wind, each step forward a battle against the elements. The humans' machinery loomed in the distance, silhouetted against the storm-lit sky. Their spires cast an eerie glow, flickering with the rhythm of the seismic pulses beneath our feet. As we approached, I caught sight of Marcus standing at the edge of a deep fissure, staring into its depths as if communing with the abyss itself. Beside him, a column of machinery hummed with power, its cables snaking into the earth like the roots of some twisted tree. He didn't turn as we approached, his focus entirely on the churning, molten glow far below. "Marcus," I shouted over the storm, forcing him to acknowledge us. "This has to stop. You're tearing the planet apart. Do you even realize what you've unleashed?" He turned slowly, rain streaming down his face, his expression calm, too calm. "It's already too late to stop, Envoy. We're past the point of no return." Ulnar stepped forward, his voice trembling with desperation. You do not understand. The seismic activity is spreading far beyond your outpost. If this continues, the entire planetary crust could rupture. You could trigger a chain reaction that would crack the planet open like an egg," Marcus interrupted, his voice cold and unyielding. "I know, Ulnar. I know exactly what's at stake." For a moment, the storm's fury seemed to quiet, as if the air itself held its breath. I felt my hands clench into fists, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Then why are you still doing this?" I demanded. "Why would you risk everything, your lives, this planet, even your own people? What could possibly be worth that?" Marcus's gaze met mine, and in his eyes, I saw something that froze the blood in my veins. It was not madness or malice, it was a fierce, unrelenting purpose, a conviction that seemed to burn through him like a fever. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice low and rough. "This isn't about us, it's about what lies beneath." He gestured toward the churning depths of the fissure, where the molten glow pulsed like a heartbeat. "We discovered something down there, Envoy, something ancient, buried deep beneath the crust. A power source beyond anything we've ever seen, something that could change the fate of every human colony in the galaxy. But it's not just power, it's life." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "Life?" I echoed, the word barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" He glanced toward the fissure again, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, a shadow that hinted at the fear lurking beneath his resolve. "We found traces of an ancient entity, something that has lain dormant for eons. It's not alive in the way we understand, but it's sentient in its own way, and it's feeding off the energy of this world, shaping it, growing stronger." Ulnar's eyes widened in horror. You awakened it." Marcus nodded, his face set in grim lines. "It's why we're racing against time. We thought we could control it, harness its power, but it's more than we anticipated. Now, it's pushing back, trying to break free. If we stop now, it will consume us all, take everything we've built and turn it into something else." I took a step closer, my mind reeling with the implications. "So you're risking the planet, trying to channel its energy to keep this entity contained?" "It's our only option," Marcus said, his voice tinged with desperation. "If we can bind it, we can control it, use it to terraform this world, to make it into a new home for humanity, a place where we can thrive without fear. But if we fail—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air, more terrifying than the storm raging around us. If they failed, the entire planet would become the entity's prison, no longer a thing that could reshape the very fabric of the world. For a long moment, we stood there, the storm lashing against us as the fissure gaped wide beneath our feet. I felt my mind race through the possibilities, weighing the risks against the slim chance of survival. If Marcus and his people truly believed they could control this entity, then stopping them now might only doom us all. But if they were wrong, if their plans backfired, the consequences would be far worse than any of us could imagine. Ulnar's voice cut through my thoughts, his tone thick with urgency. "Envoy, we cannot trust them. We must." "No," I interrupted, feeling the weight of the decision settle like a stone in my chest. "We need to buy time. We can't let the entity break free, but we also can't let them turn this planet into a weapon." Marcus's gaze sharpened, and I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes, surprise, and perhaps a trace of respect. "You want to work together? After everything?" "I don't trust you, Marcus," I said bluntly, the words cutting through the storm like a knife. "But right now, survival means finding a way to keep this planet from tearing itself apart. And that means we need to figure out how to control that thing down there, before it decides to finish what you started." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, Envoy, but understand this. We're walking a razor's edge. One wrong move, and it's over for all of us." I turned back toward the fissure, staring into its molten depths as the storm howled around us. Ulnar shifted uneasily beside me, his distrust radiating through every movement. But beneath my own fear, I felt something else take root, a cold determination, a grim resolve to see this through. Because whatever nightmare lay beneath this world, we had unleashed it together. And now we would face its judgment, one way or another. The ground shuddered beneath our feet as Marcus and I stood on the precipice, staring down into the seething rift below. The entity's influence was spreading like a stain through the planet's core, its power manifesting as unnatural tremors and heat waves. The air crackled with an energy that defied explanation, an almost tangible presence that made my skin crawl. And yet, beneath that, there was something else, something that whispered of an intelligence, a hunger far older than anything we could fathom. Marcus's face was drawn tight, the lines of his jaw rigid, but his hands, clutching the rail that lined the observation platform, trembled ever so slightly. For all his bravado, for all his certainty, I saw the fear that lurked beneath, and it mirrored the unease that coiled in my own gut. "How long do we have?" I asked, my voice barely more than a breath. Marcus didn't look at me, his gaze fixed on the boiling depths of the rift. "Days, maybe less. The entity, it's starting to learn. It knows we're trying to bind it, and it's fighting back. Every time we siphon energy, it pushes harder, tries to destabilize the crust. If we can't reinforce the containment field." He didn't need to finish the thought. I could see the data scrolling across the screens in front of him, charts and graphs tracking the seismic activity, the erratic surges of heat and pressure that were steadily rising. It was like watching a fuse burn down, with no way to know how long we had before it reached the explosive end. Ulnar paced behind us, his mandibles clacking nervously, a habit he'd picked up during our months on this forsaken world. He shot a venomous glance at Marcus, as if the human's very presence was a toxin. "You place your faith in him, envoy? In these barbarians who toy with forces they cannot comprehend?" I met Ulnar's gaze, forcing myself to keep my voice steady. "We don't have a choice, Ulnar. Right now, the only thing standing between us and planetary annihilation is Marcus's technology. If we want to survive, we have to work with him." Marcus finally tore his eyes away from the rift, fixing me with a look that was equal parts defiance and exhaustion. "We'll have to increase the energy draw. It's risky, but if we can channel enough power into the containment field, we might buy enough time to stabilize the core." "You're talking about overloading the geothermal converters," Ulnar hissed, incredulous. "That could trigger a feedback loop and cause a rupture. You would doom us all for a chance," Marcus snapped, cutting him off. "That's all we have, Ulnar. A chance to stop this before it consumes everything." A bitter retort rose to my lips, but I swallowed it down, forcing myself to focus. Marcus wasn't wrong. The readings were clear, the entity was waking up, its influence spreading through the tectonic plates like poison in a bloodstream. If we did nothing, the outcome would be the same as if we failed: destruction on a planetary scale. But still, there was that gnawing doubt in the back of my mind. What if Marcus was holding something back? What if his desperation to harness this power ran deeper than mere survival? The thought festered, casting a shadow over every word he spoke. "Fine," I said at last, my voice grim. "We'll follow your plan. But if it fails, you'd better have an escape route ready. I'm not dying on this rock because you made a miscalculation." Marcus's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. "Trust me, envoy, I don't plan on dying here either." The hours that followed were a blur of frantic preparation. Marcus's team worked tirelessly, adjusting the converter arrays and recalibrating the containment field's parameters. The air inside the main chamber was thick with tension, the low hum of machinery and the occasional tremor serving as a constant reminder of the fragility of our situation. I caught glimpses of the human workers, faces drawn with fatigue, eyes shadowed by a fear they tried to hide beneath layers of determination. They moved with a kind of mechanical precision, as if sheer willpower could stave off the impending disaster, and perhaps it could. But the question that haunted me was whether they understood the stakes, or whether, like Marcus, they had come to believe in some impossible promise of triumph. As I walked the perimeter of the facility, I found Ulnar hunched over a console, his eyes fixed on a holographic display that tracked the entity's energy patterns. His claws tapped a restless rhythm against the edge of the screen. "They are mad, Envoy," he muttered, his voice low. "They play with forces that they cannot hope to master. This creature they've awakened, its thoughts seep into the very crust of this world. I can feel its hunger, its desire to break free." I glanced around, ensuring no one else could overhear. "You think I don't know that, Omar? But what choice do we have? We need them to survive, and they need us to keep this from spiraling out of control." Ulnar's mandibles clicked together, his frustration palpable. "If they survive this, they will not stop here. They will seek out other powers, other forces to bend to their will. They will become a blight upon the galaxy." I turned to face him fully, the weariness of command weighing heavily on my shoulders. "We'll deal with that if we survive this, Ulnar. But right now, we have to focus on the immediate threat. Marcus might be reckless, but he's the only one who understands the entity's patterns well enough to have a chance at containing it." His eyes narrowed, the glow of the holographic display reflecting off his iridescent skin. "And what will you do if he cannot contain it, Envoy? If the humans fail?" I didn't have an answer for that. Not a good one, at least. Instead, I turned back to the rift, where Marcus and his team were making their final adjustments to the array. The glow from the fissure cast long shadows across the cavern walls, painting their faces in shades of orange and crimson. "We're all standing on a knife's edge," I thought, the words like a pulse in the back of my mind. "One wrong step, and everything we've worked for, everything we've sacrificed, will be swallowed by the dark." The activation sequence began with a deep, resonant hum that reverberated through the chamber, sending vibrations up through the soles of my boots. The converters flared to life, siphoning energy from the geothermal vents and channeling it through the containment field. I could feel the heat rising, the air growing thick with the charge of raw power. Marcus shouted commands, his voice cutting through the noise. "Hold the output steady. We can't afford another fluctuation." The humans around him scrambled to comply, their movements precise and synchronized. Ulnar monitored the readings from a secondary console, his mandibles grinding together as the power levels spiked. "This is too much, Envoy." The feedback. A tremor ripped through the ground, sending a cascade of debris from the ceiling. I braced myself against the console, my heart pounding in my chest. On the display, I saw the rift flare with a sudden surge of energy, an erratic pulse that twisted the containment field like a living thing. "Marcus, the entity's pushing back," I shouted, fighting to keep my voice steady. "We're losing stability." Marcus's face twisted with strain as he fought to hold the system together. "Keep it steady, we can." Before he could finish, a searing wave of heat washed over us, followed by a sound like the tearing of metal and stone. The containment field buckled, the energy flaring wild and uncontrolled. Alarms blared, filling the air with a shrill, panicked wail. "Marcus!" Ulnar's voice was a desperate plea, his claws digging into the console. "Shut it down, or we'll all—" "No!" Marcus's face was a mask of grim determination. "We're so close, we can—" The ground beneath us lurched, and the chamber filled with a blinding light as the rift erupted, molten rock and energy spilling forth like a wound torn open in the earth. And beneath it all, I felt the entity's presence, vast and ancient, reaching out with a hunger that burned in the back of my mind. And in that moment, as the world teetered on the brink, I realized that the choice Marcus had made was not just about power or survival. It was about something deeper, something that went to the core of what made humanity so terrifyingly relentless. The light seared through the observation platform, turning the world into a kaleidoscope of reds and yellows. My visor dimmed against the glare, but even through the filter, I could see the rift pulsing like a wound, energy spilling into the air. The entire structure groaned under the strain, and I could feel the heat pressing against my suit, seeping through the reinforced fabric. "Containment fields down to 30%, shouted one of Marcus's technicians, her voice barely audible over the roar of machinery and the rumble of the shifting earth. "We can't maintain this output for long." Marcus stood at the control panel, his hands flying over the console. The sweat poured off his brow, glistening in the infernal glow. "Hold it together, we just need to channel the excess." But before he could finish, another tremor ripped through the ground, more violent than the last. The chamber shook, the metal scaffolding rattling like the bones of a giant creature. A beam snapped loose, crashing to the floor with a sound like a gunshot, and I barely managed to throw myself aside before it crushed me. "Marcus, we have to shut it down," I roared, clawing my way back to my feet. "If we keep this up, the whole structure will collapse." He didn't look at me, his focus entirely on the spiraling numbers on the screen. The readings made no sense, spikes in the energy flow, currents twisting and turning against the constraints of the array. It was as if the entity beneath us was aware, fighting to free itself from the shackles we had tried to place around it. Ulnar darted over, his claws scrabbling against the console as he tried to override the sequence. "You mad fool, you'll kill us all for the sake of your pride. If we sever the conduits now, we might." But before he could finish, a bolt of energy lanced through the chamber, striking the floor between us. A burst of heat slammed into my chest, knocking me back, and I felt my skin blistering beneath the suit's protective layers. For a moment, the world swam with pain, and I tasted blood in my mouth. Marcus's voice cut through the haze, hoarse and desperate. "We're so close, damn it! We can stabilize it, just give me a few more seconds." "Marcus," I struggled to my knees, my vision blurred by the heat and the strain. "If you don't shut it down, the whole planet could go." Another tremor cut me off, this one so powerful that the floor buckled beneath my feet. I caught a glimpse of the rift widening, molten rock bubbling up from the depths, and then I saw something else, something that made my blood run cold. In the heart of the rift, where the energy swirled like a storm, shapes began to form. Shadows, twisting and writhing like serpents in the dark. They coiled through the molten rock, their outlines shifting and indistinct, but I could feel their presence, their hunger. They were alive, and they were trying to break free. "Marcus, shut it down." Ulnar's voice was a raw scream, his mandibles clacking in sheer panic. "You can't control this." Marcus's hands hovered over the controls, his face contorted with indecision, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes, something raw, desperate. He glanced at the swirling shadows in the rift, and I realized with a jolt that he wanted to see what would happen, that he was willing to risk everything for a glimpse of the unknown. But then his face hardened, and he slammed his hand down on the emergency override. The lights flickered, and the converters shuddered as the energy flow was cut off. The roar of the machinery faded, leaving only the crackling of the rift and the low, ominous rumble of the shifting earth. For a heartbeat, everything was still. And then the rift exploded. The blast flung us across the chamber like ragdolls. I hit the far wall hard enough to crack my visor, the impact driving the breath from my lungs. When I managed to drag myself upright, I saw that the containment field had shattered completely, its remnants flickering like dying fireflies in the darkness. The rift was still there, wider now, its edges fraying like torn fabric. The shadows that writhed within it pulsed with a terrible vitality, like veins carrying molten blood, and through the haze of pain and heat, I heard something, a sound that was not a sound, a pulse that resonated deep in my skull. It was the entity. It was speaking. Marcus lay crumpled near the control panel, struggling to rise. His face was a mask of pain, blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, but his eyes were locked on the rift, wide with awe and horror. It's waking up," he whispered, his voice barely more than a rasp. "Do you feel it, Envoy? It's like the heartbeat of a god." I staggered over to him, grabbing him by the collar and hauling him upright. "We need to move. Marcus, if we don't get out of here, we're going to." But before I could finish, the entity's presence surged, filling the air with a pressure that pressed against my mind like claws. My vision swam, the edges of the world blurring, and I felt a wave of emotions crash over me, rage, hunger, a cold, calculating intelligence that swept through my thoughts like a storm. And then, beneath it all, a voice, deep and ancient, carrying the weight of eons. "You have awoken me. You would bind me, but I am beyond your understanding, beyond your flesh." Marcus stiffened, his breath hitching. "It's talking to us," he gasped, his eyes wide with a terrible excitement. "Do you hear it, Envoy? It's communicating." "Release me," the voice whispered, threading through the air like smoke, "or you will suffer my wrath. You cannot contain me. You cannot comprehend the depths of what I am." I fought to keep my mind clear, to resist the pull of its influence. My hands tightened on Marcus's suit, my voice coming out in a hoarse growl. "If we don't get out of here right now, we're dead. Whatever you think you're going to learn from this thing, it won't matter when we're buried under 10 tons of rock." But even as I spoke, I could see the doubt flickering in his eyes, the longing for understanding, for power, for the secrets that lay hidden in the entity's words. And I knew, in that moment, that he wouldn't let this go, that he would never let this go. Before he could argue, I grabbed the emergency flare from my belt and slammed it into the console, triggering the facility's auto-destruct. The countdown began, the digital display flashing in harsh red against the darkness. Marcus's face twisted with fury, but I ignored him, dragging him toward the exit as the ground buckled beneath us. "You think you can stop me?" he spat, struggling against my grip. "You don't understand what we're dealing with, Envoy. This is bigger than us, bigger than any of us." I gritted my teeth, forcing him forward even as the air around us seethed with the entity's presence. "Maybe. But right now, the only thing I care about is getting out alive. And if you want to see another sunrise, you'll stop fighting me and run." We stumbled through the twisting corridors, the sound of collapsing metal and rock echoing behind us. The facility's lights flickered and died, leaving only the glow of emergency strobes to guide our way. Marcus's breathing was ragged, his footsteps unsteady, but he kept pace, his face set in a grim mask. And all the while, I felt the entity's presence in the back of my mind, a pressure that twisted and writhed, probing the edges of my thoughts. Its voice whispered in a language older than stars, promising power, promising knowledge. But I shut it out, focusing on the path ahead, on the faint hope that we could reach the surface before everything came crashing down. Behind us, the rift pulsed, growing wider, the shadows within it writhing like serpents. And as we ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something that would not be easily undone. Marcus might have sealed our fate by awakening the entity. But the question that burned in my mind was whether he had done it out of ignorance, or if he had known exactly what he was releasing into the galaxy. We burst through the last hatch just as the facility shuddered beneath us, the vibrations rippling through the ground like waves crashing against a shore. I could hear the alarms blaring in the distance, a shrill, unending wail that blended with the grinding of metal and the rumble of collapsing rock. The corridor twisted ahead of us, the walls lined with flickering lights, and I tightened my grip on Marcus's arm, dragging him forward. "Come on, keep moving," I shouted over the noise, but Marcus's steps faltered. His gaze darted back toward the direction of the rift, where the ground heaved with every pulse of the entity's power. "It's changing the environment," he muttered, his voice barely more than a rasp. "The rift is growing unstable, but it's adapting to the new conditions. If we could just study it." "No time for that," I barked, pulling him along. "We're not going to be studying anything if we get buried alive down here." But even as I spoke, a cold dread twisted in my chest. I knew that Marcus's mind was already turning over the possibilities, trying to decipher the meaning behind the entity's whispers, and I feared that, in his desperation, he might try to turn back, even with the facility collapsing around us. We stumbled through the last junction, and I felt a wave of cool air wash over us, fresh air from the surface. The exit wasn't far now. Just a few more steps, and we'd be free of the maze of tunnels that had become our tomb. But as we rounded the corner, I saw the way ahead blocked by debris, rocks and twisted metal piled high, a jagged scar where the tunnel had caved in. My heart sank, and I tightened my grip on Marcus's arm, forcing myself to think. There had to be another way out, an emergency shaft, an alternate path, anything to avoid going back toward the rift. Marcus's breath came in harsh gasps beside me, his eyes wild with panic. We're trapped. We're trapped. No, I snapped, trying to keep my voice steady. There's got to be a way. We just need to. But before I could finish, a shadow fell over us. The air grew thick, humming with an unnatural resonance that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I felt the pressure in my skull intensify, as if the entity's presence had suddenly amplified, pressing against the edges of my mind like the weight of an ocean. And then I heard it again, its voice, low and insidious, threading through the air like a knife through silk. You cannot escape me, little sparks of life. You would cage me, but you are nothing before my will. Marcus's face twisted with agony, his hands clawing at his temples. It's inside my head, he gasped, his knees buckling. I can feel it, tearing through my thoughts. I gritted my teeth against the pressure, fighting to keep my mind focused. The entity's influence was stronger now, its whispers laced with a venomous allure, promising knowledge, power, a glimpse into the mysteries of the cosmos. It offered visions, stars collapsing into black holes, galaxies spinning in the void, secrets of matter and energy that no living being had ever understood. But beneath the seductive promises, I sensed the hunger, the need that drove the entity's every word. It was a predator, and we were prey. Release me, it whispered, its voice resonating with an otherworldly cadence. Open the rift. Let me roam free, and I will spare your fragile lives. Refuse, and I will crush you like insects beneath my heel. Marcus's breathing hitched, his expression torn between terror and a terrible, reckless curiosity. Maybe it's telling the truth, he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. If we cooperate, if we understand it, maybe it won't. It's lying, I snapped, grabbing his shoulder and shaking him. It's using us, Marcus. If we give in now, it'll tear through us like paper and spread beyond this planet. We have to shut it out. But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of its presence bearing down on me, its whispers twisting through my thoughts like tendrils of smoke. I knew that we couldn't hold out much longer. The rift was widening with every second, its energies seeping through the facility like poison in the air, and if the entity managed to break free. I shoved the thought aside, focusing on the problem at hand. We needed to find another way out, or at least buy ourselves some time. My eyes darted over the debris, searching for any weakness, any gap that might offer a way through. And then I saw it, a maintenance shaft half buried beneath a fallen beam, just wide enough for us to crawl through. Over there, I gestured, dragging Marcus toward the shaft. We can make it through if we're quick. Move. He hesitated, his gaze flicking back toward the rift. But I didn't give him a chance to argue. I shoved him forward, and together we scrambled through the gap, pulling ourselves into the darkness of the shaft. The air was thick with dust and heat, but it was a reprieve from the crushing presence that lingered in the main chamber. As we crawled through the narrow passage, I could hear the rumble of collapsing rock behind us, the facility's walls groaning under the strain. The entity's whispers grew fainter, but they lingered in the edges of my mind, like a splinter I couldn't dislodge. You think you can hide from me, little sparks? Its voice echoed faintly, a mocking cadence that sent a chill down my spine. You cannot escape my reach. I will find you, and when I do, I will consume your flesh and your thoughts alike. I gritted my teeth, shoving the fear down deep. We just had to keep moving, keep fighting. I wasn't going to let this thing claim us without a struggle. After what felt like an eternity, the shaft sloped upward, and I saw a faint glimmer of light through the cracks above. I pushed the last of the rubble aside, pulling myself out onto the surface. Marcus followed, his movements slow and shaky, and together we staggered into the open air. The sky above was painted with the crimson glow of the rift, a wound in the fabric of reality that loomed over the landscape. Even from a distance, I could see the shadows writhing within it, their movements erratic and hungry. But at least out here, the entity's presence was fainter, its influence diminished by the open space. I dropped to my knees, gasping for breath, the cool wind cutting through the heat that clung to my suit. Marcus collapsed beside me, his expression dazed, as if he couldn't quite believe we had made it out alive. We need to call for extraction, he rasped, clutching at his side where his suit had torn open. "There's no way the shuttle will survive if we try to launch it. The rift's energies will tear it apart." I nodded, forcing myself back to my feet. He was right. The storm of energy around the rift was too intense for a direct escape. But if we could reach the communication beacon on the ridge, we might have a chance to transmit a distress signal before the entity's reach extended further. "We head for the beacon," I said, pulling Marcus upright. "We'll call for backup, and then we'll figure out how to seal this thing for good." He stared at me, his face pale and drawn. "Do you really think we can? After everything?" I met his gaze, my jaw clenched against the fear that gnawed at my thoughts. "We have to try. We're not giving up, not now." For a moment, the doubt lingered in his eyes. But then he nodded, his expression hardening with a resolve I hadn't seen before. Together, we set off toward the ridge, the rift's light casting long shadows behind us. The air grew colder as we ascended the ridge, each step taking us further from the crumbling ruins of the facility, but closer to the twisted rift that loomed in the sky like an unblinking eye. The landscape was bathed in its eerie crimson light, casting our shadows long and jagged across the broken terrain. The wind howled through the canyons, carrying with it the faint hum of the rift's energy, an ever-present reminder that time was running out. I kept my hand on Marcus's shoulder, guiding him as he stumbled over the uneven ground. He was moving more slowly now, his face pale beneath the grime, but his eyes had regained some of their focus. The shock of the entity's presence had faded, replaced by a grim determination that mirrored my own. "How much further to the beacon?" he asked through gritted teeth, clutching the torn edge of his suit. I could see the blood seeping through his fingers, a dark stain spreading across the fabric. "Not far," I said, forcing the words through the tightness in my chest. "Just over the next rise. We'll get there, and we'll get out of this." But even as I spoke, I knew that escape wasn't enough, not with the rift's energies surging unchecked, and the entity whispering through the shadows like a snake coiled around our thoughts. If we didn't find a way to seal it permanently, it would consume this world, and any hope of containment would be lost. We crested the ridge, and there, silhouetted against the blood-red sky, was the beacon, an old communications array perched on the edge of a cliff, its antennae angled toward the void. The sight of it sent a surge of hope through me, but it was tempered by the sight of the terrain around it, jagged and unstable, where the rift's influence had warped the rock into unnatural formations. "We need to reach it quickly," I said, glancing back at Marcus. "I'll handle the transmission. You focus on staying upright, okay?" He gave a shaky nod, and we picked our way down the slope toward the beacon, the rocks crunching beneath our boots. But as we neared the base of the array, I felt a familiar pressure in the air, an oppressive weight that prickled along my skin. The entity's presence, reaching out from the rift like a tendril of shadow. I turned, scanning the horizon, and my heart leapt into my throat as I saw the silhouette moving toward us through the haze. It was humanoid in shape, but its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, like a puppet dancing on strings. And its eyes, cold, featureless, and utterly wrong, glowed with the same crimson light that bled from the rift. "Marcus, get behind me," I shouted, raising my rifle. But even as I took aim, the creature's form seemed to blur, its edges dissolving into the air. A gunshot rang out, the recoil jarring through my arms, but the bullet passed through empty space, striking a rock beyond. The figure reformed an instant later, shifting like smoke, and I realized with a chill that it wasn't physical. It was a projection, a fragment of the entity's will made manifest. It stepped closer, its movements fluid and graceful, and its voice echoed through the air in that same insidious cadence. "You cannot flee from me, children of flesh. You cannot escape your nature." Marcus flinched at the sound, his hands flying to his ears. "Make it stop," he gasped, his voice breaking. "Please, just make it stop." But the entity ignored him, its gaze locked on me. Its voice filled the air, turning the space between us into a dark sea of murmurs. "You think you can seal me away again, as your ancestors did? You think you can deny what lies beyond the veil? You are arrogant, as they were, and you will suffer as they did." I felt my grip tighten on the rifle, my jaw clenching. "We're not like them," I spat, forcing myself to stand firm. "We're not going to let you destroy everything." The entity's laughter reverberated through my skull, a sound like grinding stone. "It is too late. The rift has been opened. My hunger will consume your world, and then I will find the others. You cannot change what you are, little sparks. You cannot defy me." I fired again, the bullet tearing through its shadowed form, but the creature merely tilted its head, as if amused by my defiance. And then it lunged, its shape dissolving into tendrils of darkness that lashed through the air, wrapping around my arms, my throat, squeezing with a force that stole my breath. I struggled against it, gasping for air, but the darkness seemed to seep into my mind, filling it with visions, stars burning out, planets devoured by shadows, the end of all light and warmth. I felt myself slipping, my thoughts unraveling beneath the weight of its presence. But then, through the haze of terror, I heard Marcus's voice, low and unsteady, but laced with a desperate determination. "I won't let you. Take him," he growled, and I saw him lift a piece of shattered metal from the ground, swinging it through the air like a club. The makeshift weapon struck the entity's form, and though it passed through its body without effect, the gesture seemed to catch its attention. The tendrils loosened their grip for a fraction of a second, and I took the chance, ripping free from its hold and stumbling backward. The entity hissed, its form rippling, and I saw a flash of frustration in its eyes. "You are nothing but insects. You cannot stand against me." "Maybe not," I rasped, my voice hoarse, "but we don't have to beat you. We just have to survive." I grabbed Marcus by the arm, dragging him back toward the beacon, and together we scrambled up the last few steps. The array loomed above us, its control panel blinking faintly with power, and I keyed in the emergency override, activating the transmission. The beacon hummed to life, its signal cutting through the rift's interference, and I felt a surge of hope as I heard the crackle of static resolve into a voice, distant, but unmistakably human. "This is command. We read you. Ground team, what's your status?" I pressed the transmitter, speaking as quickly as I could. "Facility compromised. Entity breach imminent. Requesting immediate extraction and orbital containment measures. Seal the rift, whatever it takes." There was a pause on the other end. Then the voice returned, grim and steady. "Acknowledged, ground team. Reinforcements inbound, 8 to 15 minutes. Hold position and prepare for exfil." I turned to Marcus, relief flooding through me, but I saw the shadow in his eyes, his gaze fixed on the rift, where the entity's form twisted in the air like a serpent. Its voice echoed in the wind, a promise of ruin. "You think your allies can save you? You are mine, little sparks." I tightened my grip on the transmitter, my jaw clenched. We had a chance, one last chance to hold the line, to buy time for the reinforcements to reach us. And as long as we were still breathing, we were going to fight. The beacon's signal crackled through the night, its hum cutting against the alien whispers that echoed from the rift. A distant thrum answered, a ship, somewhere high in the atmosphere, angling toward us. The faint hope of rescue simmered in the back of my mind, but the entity's presence lingered, thickening the air with its unrelenting malice. Marcus slumped beside the control panel, clutching his side where the bleeding had slowed but not stopped. I knelt beside him, trying to keep my focus as I wrapped a pressure bandage around his wound. His face was pale, but his eyes remained locked on the rift above, the eerie light painting his features in shades of crimson. "We're not going to make it 15 minutes, you know that, right?" he said, voice barely a rasp. "Shut up," I replied, forcing a grim smile. "You'll jinx it." He gave a weak laugh that dissolved into a grimace of pain, but his hand gripped my arm, fingers digging in. "You felt it, didn't you? The things it showed you. It's not just trying to kill us. It wants us to understand." I swallowed hard, the images flashing through my mind, the stars dimming, the cold hunger in the darkness beyond. "Yeah, I felt it," I admitted, "and I don't intend to let it win." He nodded, the tension between us thick with unspoken fears, but we had no time to dwell on them. The shadows stirred around the base of the ridge, and the air grew colder, the entity's presence rippling through the rocks like a living current. Its voice slid through the air, the words coiling like a serpent. "You are afraid. You see the truth beyond your fragile perceptions. You know what awaits." I forced myself to stand, raising the rifle, my grip steady despite the tremor in my chest. "You want us afraid, but fear isn't the same thing as surrender." The entity's form shifted again, its shape melting into something more solid, a humanoid silhouette, but taller, gaunter, its limbs too long, its hands tapering into claws that scraped the stone. It stepped closer, its movements unnaturally smooth, and I could see the faint shimmer of the rift's energy in its eyes, as if the void itself looked back at me. "You speak of defiance, but your kind is weak. Your flesh is brittle, your mind's fragile. You cannot stand against the tide." I took a step back, my mind racing. The entity was playing its psychological games, but that meant it wanted something from us, wanted us to hesitate, to give up before the reinforcements arrived. And if it wanted us to falter, then that meant we still had a chance. I glanced at Marcus, his face drawn tight with pain, and a thought sparked in my mind, dangerous, desperate, but maybe, just maybe, our best shot. "Marcus, remember those energy charges we pulled from the facility?" I whispered, keeping my eyes locked on the entity. He blinked, a frown crossing his face, but then his expression sharpened as he understood. "You want to rig the beacon?" "Not the beacon," I replied, my voice barely more than a breath. "The ridge. We collapse it while the entity's close. It won't destroy the rift, but it might slow it down long enough for the cavalry to get here." He hesitated, his grip on my arm tightening. "That's a long shot. If the timing's off." "Yeah," I cut in, forcing a tight smile. "But you always said I had a flair for theatrics." His answering grin was strained but real, and he nodded, reaching into his pack to retrieve the energy charges, 2 cylindrical devices, each about the size of a fist, their surfaces etched with circuits. He handed one to me, and I felt the weight of it settle into my palm, the metal cold against my skin. I set the first charge into place near the base of the beacon, glancing toward the entity as it prowled closer, its steps leaving blackened scorch marks in the earth. It seemed almost curious, as if it were waiting to see what we would do next. "You think your defiance means anything, little Sparks?" it whispered, its voice a low hiss. "You think you can change what is already written?" I didn't answer, focusing on arming the charge, my hands moving through the familiar motions. The device beeped once, its activation light blinking red, and I glanced back at Marcus, who had set the second charge into place along a fault line in the ridge. "Ready?" I asked, and he nodded, his face set with determination. We stood side by side, facing the entity as it drew nearer, its shadow spreading across the rocks like a stain. For a moment, it seemed almost amused, as if it saw through our plan and found it laughable. But then I saw its form waver, its silhouette blurring like heat ripples, and I knew we'd gotten under its skin, or whatever passed for skin in a being like this. It lunged forward, its clawed hands reaching, but I was ready, slamming the detonator switch. The charges went off with a deafening crack, and the ground beneath us bucked like a wounded beast. The cliff face exploded outward, sending rocks and debris tumbling into the void. The entity's form flickered, caught in the blast, and I saw its shape distort, the rift's energy crackling around it in a chaotic flare. We dove for cover as the shockwave rolled through the canyon, pressing our bodies against the ground. Dust and smoke filled the air, and for a moment, all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the distant roar of collapsing stone. When the dust settled, the rift's light was dimmer, its edges fraying like the fabric of a worn tapestry. The entity's form had been scattered, its presence reduced to a faint whisper in the back of my mind. But I knew it wasn't gone, only weakened, its power diminished for the moment. Marcus staggered to his feet beside me, coughing through the dust. He looked out at the fractured landscape, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. Did we buy enough time?" I helped him up, scanning the horizon. In the distance, the silhouette of a ship broke through the clouds, its engines flaring as it descended toward our position. The reinforcements, our last chance. But even as I watched, I felt a shiver run through the air, and the rift's light flared brighter, the edges knitting back together as if it were healing. The entity's voice returned, weaker but laced with venom. You cannot delay the inevitable. The rift will consume you. I gritted my teeth, my mind racing. We'd managed to buy ourselves a few precious minutes, but it wouldn't be enough if we couldn't seal the rift permanently, and that meant there was one last gamble, one last card to play. I turned to Marcus, my voice low and urgent. We need to use the ship's containment field. If we can generate a feedback pulse through the rift, it might disrupt the entity's connection. He stared at me, wide-eyed, but then he nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. All right, let's end this. Together, we turned toward the descending ship, ready to make our final stand against the darkness. The ship touched down with a rumble that sent vibrations through the fractured earth. The reinforcements were here, but as the ramp lowered and figures moved through the smoke, I knew we weren't out of danger yet. The rift loomed overhead, pulsating with unnatural energy. The entity's whispers still lingered, a faint echo in the back of my mind, like a festering wound refusing to heal. Marcus leaned heavily on me as we stumbled toward the landing bay, the ship's crew rushing out to meet us. Their eyes widened when they saw the devastation around the rift. One of them, a broad-shouldered commander with a hardened look, stepped forward, barking orders to secure the perimeter. Status report, he demanded, his gaze flicking between me and Marcus. The rift isn't closed, I said, my voice rough from the dust and smoke. We've weakened it, but it's rebuilding itself. The entity, whatever it is still inside. The commander's expression darkened, and he glanced back at his team, who were setting up a series of containment devices around the landing site. We've got enough firepower to level this place. Are you saying that's not going to be enough? I shook my head. It's not just about destruction. This thing is tethered to the rift. Destroying it won't stop the energy surge. We need to sever its connection, and the only way to do that is through a containment pulse. He frowned, clearly not liking what he was hearing, but there was no time for debate. The air crackled with static, and the rift's light flared brighter, casting long shadows over the crew. The entity's presence was growing stronger again, and we had only minutes before it regained its full strength. Marcus, still clutching his side, raised his voice. You've got a containment pulse generator on this ship, right? The commander gave a short nod. It's a prototype. We've never tested it on something this large. Then we'll have to hope it's enough, I said, stepping forward. Set it up near the rift's core. We'll need to sync it with the pulse from the ship's field to create enough disruption. The commander hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded sharply. You heard her, he barked at his team. Get the generator online, now. The crew sprang into action, racing toward the rift with heavy equipment in tow. Marcus and I followed, our bodies aching but adrenaline keeping us upright. The ground beneath us trembled as the rift's energy surged, the pulse of its light growing more erratic. The entity's voice grew louder in my mind, its words slithering through my thoughts. You think you can close the door, little spark? You cannot escape the darkness that waits beyond. I grit my teeth, shaking off the oppressive weight of its presence. This was it, the final move in a game we hadn't even realized we were playing until it was nearly too late. I wasn't about to let humanity lose. As the containment pulse generator was hauled into position, I helped Marcus rig the ship's field to amplify the effect. The interface crackled to life beneath our fingers, the energy humming through the cables as we worked. I could feel the pressure mounting, every second ticking away like a countdown to disaster. The commander joined us, his expression grim. The generator's primed. What now? I glanced at Marcus, who gave me a shaky nod, his face pale but determined. Now we trigger the pulse. The commander hesitated again. And what happens to us when it goes off? I locked eyes with him. If it works, the rift closes, the entity's connection is severed, and we all go home. if it doesn't. I didn't finish the sentence. I didn't need to. With a curt nod, the commander activated his comm unit, barking orders to his crew. The containment pulse generator began to hum, the deep, resonant sound vibrating through the ground. The energy field surrounding the ship flickered, syncing with the generator's power. The air around us grew heavy with static, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Marcus' fingers hovered over the final control panel. Ready? I nodded, my heart pounding. Do it. He slammed his hand down on the trigger, and the world exploded into light. The pulse rippled out from the generator, a wave of energy so intense it knocked us off our feet. The rift convulsed, its form warping as the pulse tore through it, distorting the fabric of space itself. The entity screamed, a sound that was not sound, a psychic wail that cut through my mind like a blade. The ground shook, and the sky above seemed to tear open, the stars blinking out one by one as the rift collapsed inward. For a moment, I thought we'd done it. I thought the pulse had worked. But then, with a sickening lurch, the rift began to reform, its light flickering like a candle in the wind, but refusing to go out. No, it should have worked, Marcus cried, his voice rising in panic. We should have severed the connection. The commander swore under his breath, his eyes wide with fear. What now? I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to process what had gone wrong. The pulse had disrupted the rift, but it hadn't been enough. The entity's presence was still there, still fighting to reassert control, and if we didn't stop it soon, the rift would tear open again, this time for good. The whispers in my head grew louder, more insistent. The entity was taunting us, mocking our efforts. You cannot stop me. You cannot change the fate that awaits your kind. But then, as the last tendrils of hope began to slip away, something shifted. The rift's light flickered, but not in the same erratic pattern as before. This time, it was deliberate, pulsing in a rhythm, one that I recognized. I turned to Marcus, my breath catching in my throat. Wait. The pulse. It's responding to something. He frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I didn't have time to explain. Instead, I scrambled toward the control panel, my fingers flying over the interface. The pulse generator wasn't just disrupting the rift, it was syncing with it, finding a harmonic frequency that resonated with the entity's connection. If we amplify the pulse, tune it to the right frequency, we might be able to sever the connection for good, I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Marcus' eyes widened as he realized what I was suggesting. But that would require... Yeah, I cut in, my heart pounding. We'll need to push the generator beyond its limits. The commander, still struggling to keep up, stepped forward. Are you saying we're going to blow it? I nodded. If we don't, the rift stays open, and the entity wins. But if we overload the generator, we can create a pulse strong enough to shut it down permanently. The commander's face hardened. Do it. With a deep breath, I keyed in the final override commands, the generator's hum rising to a deafening roar. The ground beneath us trembled, and the rift's light flared, the entity's presence surging as if sensing the impending danger. Hold on, I shouted over the din, gripping the control panel as the generator reached critical mass. The pulse erupted outward, a blinding wave of energy that tore through the air and slammed into the rift. The entity's scream echoed in my mind, but this time it wasn't taunting, it was terrified. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the rift collapsed in on itself, the light vanishing as quickly as it had come. The entity's presence was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. The moment the rift closed, the silence seemed to press down on us like a physical weight. Dust swirled in the air, mingling with a lingering, acrid scent of burnt metal and ozone. I stood there, blinking in the darkness, my ears still ringing from the blast, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Marcus staggered beside me, clutching his side, his face smeared with grime and blood. He managed a shaky laugh, the sound thin and brittle in the sudden stillness. We did it. We actually did it. I nodded, still feeling the residual tremor of the containment pulse echoing in my bones. But as the adrenaline began to fade, a cold unease settled into my gut. The rift might have been sealed, but something still felt wrong. It was as if a shadow lingered in the air, the memory of the entity's presence not quite fully banished. The commander's voice cut through my thoughts, harsh and unyielding. "Status, now, is the entity neutralized?" Marcus and I exchanged a glance, uncertainty flickering between us. "The rift is closed," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "But I don't know if we've destroyed the entity. It's more like we've forced it back." The commander's jaw clenched, and his eyes hardened. "Then we have to be prepared for the possibility that it could return. I'll report back to the fleet, get them to start scans. If it's so much as twitches, I want to know." I watched as he walked away, barking orders into his comm unit. Around us, the crew began to recover, checking the equipment and surveying the damage. I could see the tension in their movements, the unspoken fear that lingered in every glance toward the sky. Marcus pulled himself up, wincing as he pressed a hand to his ribs. "We bought time, but it doesn't feel like a victory, does it?" "No," I admitted, scanning the dark horizon. The stars had returned, cold and distant against the backdrop of space, but the memory of that terrible, writhing light lingered in my mind. "It feels more like we've delayed something, and whatever's on the other side of that rift, it knows we're here now." Marcus fell silent, his expression somber. He glanced toward the makeshift field base where the commander's crew worked feverishly, then back at me. "We're not done, are we?" "Not even close," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. We spent the next few hours working alongside the crew, helping them secure the area and dismantle the damaged containment generator. It had served its purpose, but at the cost of burning out most of its circuits. The commander ordered a full diagnostic of the surrounding space, searching for any remaining traces of the entity's energy signature. But as the hours ticked by, no new readings appeared. Just as I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, we had truly severed the connection, a low-frequency ping echoed through the comms. The commander's head snapped up, his expression sharp. "What is that? I want a full analysis." A technician bent over the console, frowning as she scanned the data. Her face paled. It's coming from beneath the surface." My blood ran cold. Beneath us, the ground was riddled with ancient tunnels and caverns, remnants of the planet's forgotten civilization. If the entity hadn't been destroyed, if it had simply retreated. The commander cursed under his breath. "I want a team down there now. We'll need to sweep the tunnels for any sign of residual energy." I stepped forward, Marcus at my side. "We'll go," I offered, my voice steady despite the unease gnawing at my chest. "We're the most familiar with the entity's patterns. If it's hiding down there, we'll find it." The commander studied us for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Fine. Take 2 of my men with you, and keep a direct line open. The moment you find anything, you report in. Understood?" "Understood," Marcus and I replied in unison. The descent into the tunnels was a stark contrast to the chaos above ground. The air grew colder, stale with a hint of long-forgotten decay. Our footsteps echoed off the stone walls, the beam of our lights cutting through the thick darkness. Marcus and I led the way, with 2 of the commander's soldiers trailing behind, their rifles held at the ready. We moved cautiously, the silence weighing heavily on us. The only sound was the hum of our breathing through the filtered masks, and the occasional crackle of static on the comms. As we ventured deeper, the temperature dropped further, and frost began to form on the stone around us, a thin sheen that glowed faintly in the dim light. "It's colder than it should be down here," Marcus muttered, his voice low and tense. "The temperature drop is localized, just like the area around the rift." I nodded, gripping my weapon tighter. The entity's presence, it could be influencing the environment. We pressed on, the tunnel walls closing in as the air grew more frigid. The deeper we went, the more I felt a familiar pressure in the back of my mind, a faint whisper that tugged at the edges of my thoughts. It was weaker than before, but it was there. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a chamber where the tunnel split into 3 paths. I held up a hand, signaling the others to stop. "Hold on. We need to figure out which way the signal's coming from." Marcus checked the scanner, squinting at the readouts. "Left tunnel," he said finally, pointing to the path that disappeared into deeper darkness. "But it's faint, like it's shielded somehow." We moved down the left tunnel, the air growing colder with every step. The frost thickened, turning the stone walls into shimmering sheets of ice. My breath fogged the visor of my mask, and my hands were starting to go numb despite the thermal gear. The whispers grew louder, a discordant murmur that filled my mind like a distant chant. Marcus glanced at me, his expression grim, and I knew he heard it too. As we rounded a bend, the tunnel opened into a vast cavern, the ceiling arching high above us. In the center of the chamber, embedded in the frozen ground, was a twisted mass of what looked like obsidian, shot through with veins of sickly green light. It pulsed faintly, the same rhythm as the rift's dying heartbeat. "That's it," Marcus whispered, his voice filled with a mix of awe and dread. "That's what's left of the entity." I moved closer, feeling the pressure in my mind increase with every step. The obsidian mass thrummed with a dark energy, its surface rippling like liquid glass. I reached out, my gloved hand hovering just inches from its surface, and the whispers surged, flooding my thoughts with a chaotic torrent of images and emotions. Memories that weren't mine, echoes of a mind far older and more alien than I could comprehend. Despair, rage, hunger, and beneath it all, a seething hatred for everything that lived, that dared to resist its pull. I jerked my hand back, my heart pounding. It's still alive, just dormant, waiting for a chance to reopen the rift. Marcus nodded, swallowing hard. "We need to destroy it. Completely, this time." But even as I readied my weapon, a part of me hesitated. The entity's thoughts brushed against mine, a desperate plea woven into the chaos. It spoke not in words, but in raw emotion, a fear that mirrored our own. I shook off the strange feeling. Whatever it was, it had tried to break through, to consume our world. But a shadow of doubt lingered in my mind as I aimed my weapon at the pulsating core. The cavern was silent, save for the thrumming pulse of the entity's core, like a heartbeat echoing through the frozen ground. Marcus and I stood at the edge of the obsidian mass, the strange green light reflecting off our visors, casting eerie shadows on the ice-covered walls. My finger hovered over the trigger, my mind warring with the urgency to destroy the entity and the strange, inexplicable hesitation that had taken root inside me. Marcus noticed my hesitation, his voice cutting through the murmur in my head. "What are you waiting for? Shoot it. We need to end this before it gets a chance to recover." I tightened my grip on the weapon, but the images flooding my mind swirled faster, more insistent. It was as if the entity was trying to communicate, its thoughts chaotic but laden with a sense of desperation. A flickering image flashed in my head, of a world crumbling under fire, of a desperate struggle for survival, much like our own. But then, the image shifted, warping into something darker, a vision of entire worlds consumed, pulled into the maw of an endless void, a hunger that could never be sated. I shook my head, gritting my teeth against the onslaught. "It's trying to get inside my head, Marcus. I think. It's afraid." Marcus glanced at the core, his face hardening. "Afraid or not, it's a threat. This thing nearly tore a hole in reality, and it won't stop until it finishes the job. We don't have the luxury of sympathy." His words snapped me back to the cold reality of our situation. I steadied my aim, focusing on the entity's core, feeling the weapon hum as it charged. But just as I prepared to fire, the whispers sharpened into a single, desperate thought, one word resonating in my mind. Survive. The word tore through me, filled with a depth of emotion that left me breathless. Fear, pain, loss, emotions that felt disturbingly human. My hand faltered, and the weapon's charge dissipated. I stumbled back, my head pounding with the force of the entity's thoughts. Marcus's expression darkened as he saw me lower the weapon. What the hell are you doing? We can't afford to let this thing live. It's not that simple, I shot back, my voice raw with frustration. I don't think it's just a mindless entity. It's more complicated. It's afraid of something. It's trying to survive, like we are. Marcus's jaw clenched, but I could see the uncertainty flicker in his eyes. He glanced at the core, then back at me. Whatever its reasons, it's still dangerous. And if we don't destroy it now, it might find a way to reopen the rift. I knew he was right. The entity's existence posed a threat, one we couldn't fully understand. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than we realized. That maybe, just maybe, we were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. Before I could make a decision, the ground beneath us shuddered, a deep rumble that sent cracks spiderwebbing through the ice. The green light pulsed brighter, and the air grew colder, the frost thickening into sharp, crystalline shards. "Report, now." The commander's voice barked through the comms, but his transmission was drowned out by the growing hum from the entity's core. The sound was rising, a discordant wail that reverberated through the cavern, making my bones ache. Marcus's face twisted with alarm. "It's destabilizing. If we don't shut it down now, it could trigger another rift." Panic flared in my chest. I raised my weapon again, but the whispers surged, a storm of thoughts that crashed against my mind, drowning out reason. Images of dying stars, of civilizations crumbling to dust, of a darkness that swallowed everything. I staggered, my vision blurring. Marcus grabbed my shoulder, his grip like iron. "Snap out of it! Focus, damn it!" With a final burst of will, I pushed the whispers back, forcing myself to focus on the reality in front of me. But as I did, something shifted in the core, an echo, a resonance that rippled through the air. The green light flickered, then stabilized, the hum fading to a low, steady rhythm. Marcus stared at the core, confusion crossing his features. "What? What did you do?" "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely more than a whisper. My mind was spinning, but one thing was clear. The entity was no longer trying to tear its way back into our reality. It was waiting. The ground stopped shaking, and the air grew still, the frost slowly retreating from the walls. Marcus released his grip on my shoulder, his expression wary. "This doesn't feel right. It's like it's holding back." I nodded, my thoughts racing. Maybe it's realized it can't win by force, but that doesn't mean it's safe. We need to figure out what it's planning, and fast. Marcus glanced at the core again, then back at me. "You think it's trying to bargain with us?" "I think it's trying to survive," I replied, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my gut. "Just like we are. But we have to be careful. If we make the wrong move, it could turn against us in an instant." We stood there in tense silence, the core's green light casting long shadows across the cavern. For a moment, it almost felt like we were standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between the threat of the entity and the uncertain future it represented. Then, the comms crackled again, the commander's voice breaking through. "What's your status? We detected a massive energy surge. What the hell is going on down there?" Marcus glanced at me, then spoke into the comms, his voice grim. "We've got a situation, sir. The entity, it's still active, but it's not attacking. It's almost like it's waiting for something." There was a pause, then the commander's voice came back, cold and sharp. "If it's waiting, then it's buying time. Whatever it's planning, we can't let it complete. You have authorization to neutralize the threat. Use whatever means necessary." I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. The entity's thoughts still lingered at the edges of my mind, a tangle of fear and desperation. I knew what I had to do, but doubt gnawed at me, a voice that whispered of other possibilities. Marcus watched me, his expression conflicted. "You think there's a chance we can communicate with it? Find out what it wants?" "I don't know," I replied honestly. "But if there's even a chance, we have to try. Otherwise, we're just repeating the same mistakes that got us here." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right, but if it tries anything, we end it. No second chances." "Agreed," I said, feeling a strange, hollow determination settle in my chest. I turned back to the core, feeling the entity's presence thrumming in the air around me. My mind reached out tentatively, brushing against the edges of its thoughts. And in that moment, a flicker of understanding passed between us, two beings standing on the edge of extinction, staring into the same abyss. The entity's thoughts flickered through my mind like a dying transmission, fragments of alien emotions and images that I could barely comprehend. But beneath the chaos, there was a thread of coherence, something that hinted at a deeper purpose. I focused on that thread, letting the presence of the entity draw closer, allowing its desperate thoughts to bleed into my consciousness. Marcus watched me with a mixture of unease and caution, his weapon still trained on the pulsing core. "You sure about this, James? It could be playing you, buying time until it can attack again." I nodded, though uncertainty gnawed at me. "I don't think it has anything left to fight with, Marcus. It's trying to make us understand something. But I need to know more." He tightened his grip on the rifle, but held his ground, his eyes darting between me and the shifting light of the core. "I hope you know what you're doing, because if it's a trick, I won't hesitate to pull the trigger." I swallowed the knot of fear in my throat and took a step closer to the core, feeling the air thrum with energy. My mind reached out again, brushing against the entity's thoughts. They surged forward, a storm of half-formed images and sounds, overwhelming in their intensity. A vision of a world torn asunder, a once thriving planet now consumed by darkness, a civilization crumbling under the weight of its own creation, their technology spiraling beyond control. And amid the chaos, a lone being, desperately searching for a way to save its people, its form flickering between corporeal and something else entirely. The scene shifted to show the entity itself, standing before a rift, just like the one it had opened on Earth, its gaze filled with desperation as it tried to halt the spreading void. "Survive," the entity's thoughts echoed in my mind, tinged with a pain that was both foreign and familiar. It was more than just a plea, it was a story, a history of loss and failure, of a species that had reached too far and paid the price. I staggered back, my vision swimming with afterimages of the entity's memories. Marcus caught my arm, his voice urgent. "What did you see? What is it trying to show you?" It destroyed its own world," I murmured, the realization settling heavily in my chest. "They tried to harness the same power it used to create the rift, but they couldn't control it. They tore their own reality apart, and this thing, whatever it is, was all that survived." Marcus's expression hardened. "And now it's trying to do the same to us? Spread its mistakes to our world?" "No," I said, shaking my head as the images settled into place. "It's trying to stop it. That's why it opened the rift. It was trying to contain the energy before it could spread. But it didn't understand our reality, our laws of physics. It overestimated its own strength and lost control. Now it's trapped here, just like we are." Marcus's face twisted with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You're saying it's some kind of guardian? A failed protector?" I met his gaze, feeling the weight of the entity's presence pressing against my mind. "Something like that. It's not a hero or a villain, it's just trying to survive, like we are. But if we can understand how it controls the rift energy, we might have a chance to stabilize the tier and stop it from spreading." Marcus hesitated, then nodded, though suspicion still lingered in his eyes. "And if you're wrong? If it's just buying time to finish what it started, then you do what you have to," I replied, my voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at my gut. "But I have to try, Marcus. We've lost too much already to turn back now." He studied me for a moment longer, then lowered his rifle slightly, giving me a terse nod. "Fine. But make it quick, before command decides to blow us all to hell." I turned back to the core, focusing on the flickering light and the whispers that thrummed through the air. I reached out with my thoughts, trying to bridge the gap between our minds, to find a common thread of understanding. And slowly, the chaos began to coalesce into something more defined, a sequence, a rhythm, like a pulse that echoed in time with the entity's core. A realization struck me like a lightning bolt. The entity wasn't just trying to survive, it was attempting to reverse the rift, to draw the energy back into itself and close the tier. But it couldn't do it alone. It needed an anchor in our reality, a stable point to latch onto. "Marcus, I think I understand," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "It needs our help to stabilize the rift, to reverse the flow of energy and seal the tier. If we can sync its core to our generator's power grid, we might be able to control the reaction and shut it down." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "And what happens to it if we succeed? Does it survive?" I hesitated, the weight of the question pressing down on me. "I don't know. It's a gamble. But if we don't try, the rift will keep spreading until it devours everything." He cursed under his breath, but nodded sharply. "Then let's do it. But if this thing makes a move, any move, I'm pulling the plug." I moved quickly, connecting the generator's cables to the input ports on the entity's core. The moment the circuit engaged, a surge of energy rippled through the air, the green light intensifying until it cast the entire cavern in an otherworldly glow. The hum of the generator merged with the core's pulse, creating a strange, harmonic resonance that vibrated through my bones. For a moment, I feared it wouldn't work, that the entity's power would spiral out of control again, consuming us in a wave of energy. But then, the light began to stabilize, the rift's edges warping and shrinking as the entity's energy flowed back into the core. "It's working," I breathed, feeling a surge of hope. "We're stabilizing the rift." Marcus watched the scene with wary eyes, his finger still poised over the trigger. "Let's hope you're right, James, because if this goes south, we're out of options." As the rift's energy ebbed, I felt the entity's thoughts brushing against mine again, fainter this time, as if it was slipping away. It sent a final, fleeting image, a memory of a world restored, of a reality that had survived the darkness. And then, the light in the core dimmed, the entity's presence fading like the last echo of a dying star. The cavern grew silent, the air heavy with the weight of what we had just witnessed. Marcus lowered his rifle, letting out a long breath. "Is it gone?" "I think so," I replied, feeling a strange emptiness settle in my chest. "It's done what it needed to. Now it's up to us to make sure the rift stays closed." He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on the darkened core. "Let's hope Command understands what happened here, because I don't know how we're going to explain this." I glanced at the now stabilized rift, a sense of weary relief washing over me. But beneath the relief, there was a shadow of unease, a feeling that our encounter with the entity had only scratched the surface of something far larger and more dangerous than we could comprehend. We had bought time, but the future of our world, and the secrets buried in the entity's past, still loomed like a shadow on the horizon. The containment chamber stood eerily quiet, the green glow now a dim pulse beneath the reinforced glass. Marcus and I watched the core, the entity's power ebbing like the last breath of a dying sun. The rift had shrunk to a faint shimmer, barely a scar in the fabric of reality. But my mind remained tangled with questions, threads of unease that I couldn't shake loose. "What now?" Marcus's voice broke the silence, low and tense. "We've got the rift stabilized, but I'm guessing that's not the end of it, is it?" I looked at the core, its once shifting lights now dulled to a faint, irregular throb. There was no sign of the entity's presence in my mind, but a lingering trace of its desperation clung to my thoughts, a sense that we'd only postponed the inevitable. "No, it's not," I admitted, running a hand through my sweat-damp hair. "The rift might be stable for now, but that energy is still there, locked inside this thing. And if we can't find a way to keep it contained permanently—" Marcus didn't need me to finish. He let out a sharp breath, tension coiled tight in his frame. "So, what? We just sit on it and hope it doesn't blow? Command's going to want answers, James. They're going to want to know what happened here." I knew he was right, but the words felt like lead in my chest. "And what are we supposed to tell them, Marcus? That a dying alien tried to save our planet by tearing it open, then begged us to seal the wound it made? They won't believe it, not unless we can prove it." Marcus gave a grim chuckle, shaking his head. "Prove it to who? If this thing's dead, we've lost our only witness, and as far as Command's concerned, All they're going to see is a couple of humans messing with alien tech they barely understand. The weight of his words sank in, and a cold realization settled over me. Command would never trust what we'd seen, what we'd learned. They'd see the entity's core as a threat, an anomaly to be dissected and weaponized. And in their rush to understand its power, they might unleash the very thing we'd fought so hard to contain. Then we don't give them the chance, I said, a resolve hardening in my chest. We take this thing, everything we've learned, off the grid. Find a way to stabilize the energy ourselves before they get their hands on it. Marcus stared at me, incredulity flashing in his eyes. You're talking about going rogue, James. Hiding an alien artifact from the people who trusted us to contain it. You think they're going to let us walk away from this? No, I don't, I replied, meeting his gaze. But I think if we don't, we'll be handing them a bomb with a timer we can't control. They'll tear it apart trying to figure out how it works, and if they trigger a reaction. He cursed under his breath, running a hand over his stubble. Damn it, James. You're really going to make me the bad guy here, aren't you? Fine. But we're going to need a plan. A good one. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. First, we need to move the core somewhere secure, somewhere off the grid where they won't think to look. There's an old research outpost near the Cannes sector, abandoned after funding cuts. It's isolated, got its own power source. We could use it to run tests without anyone finding us. And then what? Marcus asked, his tone skeptical. We just hide out and hope the rift doesn't start up again. No, we study it, I replied, the urgency building in my voice. Figure out how to stabilize the energy permanently, maybe even find a way to control it. If we can understand what the entity was trying to do, maybe we can finish the job it started. Marcus looked at the darkened core, his expression hardening. All right, but if we're doing this, we're doing it my way. I'm not going to let you play scientist while this thing might be sitting on another explosion. We keep a failsafe, one wrong move, and I'll shut it down for good. I nodded, accepting the terms. It wasn't trust, but it was a pact, one forged in the shadow of something far bigger than either of us, and it would have to be enough. We worked quickly, disconnecting the core from the facility's power grid and loading it into a reinforced transport pod. The core thrummed faintly, its glow barely more than a flicker, but as I sealed the pod, a shiver ran down my spine, a sense that something was watching from the shadows between worlds. Marcus guided the transport into the darkness beyond the facility, the engines humming as we slipped away from the watchful eyes of command. I watched the facility's lights fade in the distance, a knot of uncertainty twisting in my chest. We're really doing this, Marcus muttered, his grip tight on the controls. I hope you know what you're getting us into, James. So do I replied, my gaze drifting to the pod's faint glow. But whatever happens, at least we're choosing our own path. The outpost loomed ahead of us, a dark silhouette against the stars. It had been abandoned for years, its systems left to gather dust in the void. But as we touched down and activated the dormant generators, the place came alive with a low hum, lights flickering on like echoes from a forgotten era. We set up the core in the central lab, rerouting the outpost's power into the containment chamber. I watched as the core's light brightened, stabilizing in the controlled environment, its pulse steady but faint. Marcus kept his rifle close, eyes scanning the shadows for threats. But for now, the core seemed dormant. As the outpost settled into a rhythm of quiet activity, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. But in that stillness, the weight of our choice pressed down on me, the enormity of what we'd taken into our hands. I thought of the entity's last thoughts, its desperate plea for survival, its memories of a world torn apart by its own hubris, and I couldn't help but wonder if we were making the same mistake, reaching for power we barely understood. But it was too late for doubts. We had crossed the threshold, and there was no turning back. The future of our world, of everything we knew, now depended on whether we could control the power that had slipped through the cracks of reality. And in the distance, I could almost feel the cold gaze of the council watching, their judgment hovering like a storm on the horizon. The silence of the outpost was deceptive. a veneer of calm draped over a tempest brewing just beneath the surface. Days passed as Marcus and I dove into our research, the core pulsating steadily in its chamber, a heart beating in a body long abandoned. Each time I approached it, I felt the weight of its alien essence, a power both intoxicating and terrifying. We worked tirelessly, poring over data streams, cross-referencing every scrap of information we could find. I combed through the ancient texts that spoke of the entity, piecing together its history. It had once been a guardian, a protector of its world, until it had become a harbinger of destruction. This realization hung over me like a cloud, thickening with each discovery we made. "The energy levels are fluctuating," Marcus called out one day, his voice sharp with concern. He stood over a console, analyzing the readouts. "We need to stabilize it before it becomes volatile." I rushed to his side, scanning the screens. "What's causing the fluctuation?" He shook his head. "I don't know. It's like there's something inside, an echo of its consciousness. It's as if it's still fighting to communicate." I frowned, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. What if it's trying to warn us? Before I could voice my fears, the lights in the outpost flickered, a deep rumble echoing through the corridors. The core surged with energy, its glow intensifying, casting eerie shadows on the walls. "Get back," Marcus shouted, pushing me away as alarms blared. The containment chamber shook violently, the core vibrating like a tuning fork, an ominous thrum filling the air. I gripped the edge of the console, heart racing as I tried to stabilize the readings. "Override the energy output," I yelled, my voice barely cutting through the chaos. "Working on it," Marcus snapped, fingers flying over the controls. "But it's like it's fighting us." As the energy levels climbed, a vision flashed in my mind, an image of the entity, its desperate plea echoing in my thoughts. It wasn't just a core, it was a remnant of something alive, something that had once fought to protect its world. I felt an urge to reach out, to connect with it, but the intensity of its power felt like fire against my skin. "James," Marcus's voice cut through my reverie. "We can't hold this much longer, it's going to blow." In a split second, I made a decision. "We need to release some of the energy, to let it go." "What? Are you insane?" he shot back, eyes wide with disbelief. "If we do that, we'll lose control." "Or we'll destroy ourselves," I retorted, locking eyes with him. "Trust me. I'll do it." Marcus hesitated, fear flickering across his face. But as the alarms blared louder, he nodded. "All right, just be careful." With a deep breath, I initiated the release sequence, feeling the core's energy pulse beneath my hands. The chamber trembled as I guided the excess energy out, my mind racing with a flurry of sensations, the entity's memories flooding through me, its final moments replaying like a tragic film. And then, in a burst of light, it happened. The energy erupted from the core, swirling in a kaleidoscope of colors, an aurora of power that filled the chamber. I felt the entity's presence peak, a final scream of anguish that resonated within me before it faded into the ether. And just like that, the chaos subsided. The core dimmed, its light reduced to a soft glow, the alarms falling silent. I collapsed to the floor, breathless, the weight of what I had experienced crashing over me. "James," Marcus rushed to my side, concern etched across his features. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I gasped, forcing myself to sit up. "But we need to act fast. We've unleashed something powerful, and I don't know what it means." As I steadied my breath, I sensed it, a pulse of energy lingering in the air, a faint whisper of the entity's essence. It felt different now, calmer, almost like a prayer for redemption. But outside, I could hear the telltale hum of engines approaching, the sharp snap of docking clamps locking into place. The council was here. "We need to move," Marcus urged, panic threading his words. "They'll come looking for us." I nodded, pushing myself to my feet. "Grab what you can. We can't let them take the core." We gathered our equipment in a frenzy, adrenaline coursing through our veins as we prepared to abandon the outpost. The glow of the core faded as we left, its energy still lingering in the air, a testament to the bond forged between us and the entity we had fought to understand. As we slipped into the shadows, the sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors. The Council's agents were closing in, and with every second that passed, our chance of escape slipped further away. "Through the back," I whispered, motioning toward an emergency exit. But as we darted through the narrow passage, the weight of our choices pressed heavy on my chest. We had uncovered the truth of the core, the remnants of a dying guardian trying to save its world. But would the Council see it that way? Or would they condemn us for daring to understand what we were never meant to? We emerged into the cold night, the stars glimmering above us, distant witnesses to the chaos unfolding below. The outpost had begun to flood with the Council's forces, their ships casting a stark glow against the darkened horizon. I could feel their eyes scanning the area, searching for us like predators on the hunt. "Where to now?" Marcus asked, scanning our surroundings. "There's a transport hangar a few clicks west," I replied, heart racing. "If we can reach it, we might find a way to escape the sector before they catch up." But as we sprinted through the underbrush, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Council was already one step ahead of us. We had defied them, dug into something they deemed forbidden, and now they would seek to silence us. We reached the hangar, its doors looming before us like a dark mouth ready to swallow us whole. I hesitated, memories of the core flooding my mind, the plea of the entity still echoing in my thoughts. I couldn't let it all end here, not after everything we'd uncovered. "Marcus, if we don't make it," I began, but he cut me off. "We will make it," he insisted, determination flooding his voice. "We'll find a way." I nodded, but as we entered the hangar, the air shifted. Figures emerged from the shadows, Council agents armed and ready. The tension in the air crackled, like the calm before a storm. "Stand down," one of the agents commanded, their voice cold and authoritative. "You are in violation of Council orders. Surrender the core." I exchanged a glance with Marcus, fear and resolve flashing through his eyes. We were cornered, but we wouldn't go down without a fight. "Marcus, get to the ship," I shouted, pushing him toward the cockpit. "I'll hold them off." "James, no," he protested, panic gripping his voice. "Just go," I insisted, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'll be right behind you." As Marcus scrambled toward the ship, I turned to face the agents, adrenaline surging through my veins. "You won't take it from us," I shouted, standing my ground. The agents advanced, weapons raised, but I refused to back down. This was our moment to make a stand, to show them that humanity was not to be trifled with. We had faced the unknown, battled for our future, and now we would not be silenced. "Open fire," the lead agent barked, and in that split second, I felt a surge of energy pulse through me, a wave of power that echoed the entity's essence. It coursed through my veins, igniting every fiber of my being. I felt the air around me shift, a barrier of energy forming as the agents fired. The shots ricocheted harmlessly off the field, leaving me unharmed. In that moment, I understood. The entity had passed its essence into me, a final gift of power in the face of despair. With a shout, I surged forward, pushing against the barrier, the energy wrapping around me like a cloak. The agents faltered, their eyes widening in shock as I advanced. "Enough!" I cried, my voice resonating with authority. "We are not your monsters." In that instant, I saw the fear in their eyes, the recognition that we were no longer just humans, they were facing something greater than themselves. The tide had shifted. The agents hesitated, and in that moment, I felt the core's energy surge within me, a pulse of strength guiding my actions. I called on it, reaching for the echoes of the entity's consciousness, feeling its presence weave through mine. "Release the core," I demanded, my voice firm. "We will not be your experiment." The agents looked at each other, uncertainty flooding their ranks. And as they lowered their weapons, Marcus emerged from the ship, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. "James, what are you doing?" he shouted, taking in the scene. "I'm giving us a chance," I replied, my gaze locked on the Council agents. "We can't let them control us. We need to show them what humanity is capable of." With that, I directed the energy toward the hangar doors, forcing them open with a surge of power. The agent stumbled back, bewildered, as the wind whipped through the space, carrying away the weight of our fears. "Now!" I yelled to Marcus, and together we rushed into the ship. We took off into the night sky, the stars beckoning us forward. As we broke through the atmosphere, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. We had tasted the power of the core, felt the essence of the entity within us, and in doing so, we had unlocked a deeper understanding of what it meant to be human. We were resilient, creative, and capable of forging our own destiny, even in the face of overwhelming odds. In the end, we had not just saved ourselves, but had also honored the entity's sacrifice. We would carry its memory with us, a reminder of the strength that comes from understanding, compassion, and the courage to stand against tyranny.